Get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Coffee with a Forestry Specialist today. We're expanding our reach and really excited to bring to you Kathy Decker. Kathy works with the Forest Parks and Recreation Department, and I'm going to let her tell a little bit about yourselves. I just want to let you know that Vermont Coverts and VWA are so happy that you're here to join us today to further your knowledge and answer your questions about forest and forest related issues. It's so important that our landowners are out there connected to their land, learning and figuring out what they can do to improve forest resources here in Vermont. So thank you so much for being on this call. So Kathy, I'm going to turn it over to you. I ask that everybody keep their mics muted. Questions can be typed into the chat box. So once Kathy finishes sort of introducing herself, telling us, kind of what it means to be a forestry specialist, and we'll take questions. Kathy?
Great, thanks, Lisa. I'm really glad you asked me to do this. At first, I was like, well, what do I have to say? But as you listen, my passion has been forest health for quite a while, and I'll just tell you about what I do here for the department. And so I work in the forest protection section, and that section manages sort of the forest health end of things, as far as looking at pests, looking at tree condition on a global, like all over the state, and also down to like an individual level if people have trees with health issues. And we also have the fire program. So I'll go into a little more detail about what each of those things has and what we do. I'm going to start with fire. So we monitor fire weather on every day in the state and put out a daily fire danger report. So all of you know that little smoky bear sign with the low, medium, and high. There's a lot of science behind where those words come from. And we have some folks on our team who monitor that every day and come out with that rating every single day. There's resources on our website. We also have a listserv that we send that information out to every day. And that's, one of the fire is kind of one of those things where it's really weather dependent, and monitoring that weather helps us know if fire danger is going to be high or low. And then also giving those resources out to the fire departments, fire wardens, and other people who need to know, mainly so they're prepared if something's coming down the pike where it's getting drought conditions or something like that. Wind is another driver of fire. So we've got that whole component of weather and fire related information. But then probably the biggest thing that you people are probably more aware of is forest health. We have a series of monitoring plots that we go out and measure on a yearly basis. And those are mainly around maple. The North American Maple Project was started way back in the early 80s, and Vermont is actually still carrying those monitoring plots out even now. And a lot of states had dropped out. It was a very big program. So we actually go out every single year monitoring these plots, there's sort of subjective evaluations, because you really can't do a lot of specific measurement, but density of the foliage, the color of the foliage, if there's any defoliators active. And then we also have a series of pheromone trapping that we do. So there's certain insects out there that we are very concerned about that are common and continual, things like gypsy moth, forest tent caterpillar, spruce budworm. So every year we put out traps to monitor for those pests. And what we do is we catch them, they die in the little cup that we collect them in, and then we count them. And believe it or not, we can determine if the population is going up by the number of moths we catch each year. So it's almost like a predictor for what's going to happen the following year. So something like forest tent caterpillar, I'm sure you've all heard about and seen the damage that it happens. We've been watching that, and we kind of know it's going to spike, and then very quickly will die off the other side. But we continually monitor that so we can see that information. Another thing we do is we do an aerial survey every year, and actually today might be the first year we're getting up in the plane. It's really incredible. And so the things that are happening on the landscape, maybe we're not trapping for, and maybe we're not catching them in our monitoring plots, we get to actually look down on from the sky and map it all. And that is really one of the most, I think, one of my favorite things to do is to see everything from the sky. So that's pretty incredible. And then, so we've got fire, we've got the health, and then invasive plants are another piece that we work on as well. So we have Elizabeth Spinney. I don't know if most of you hopefully have heard of her. She manages our invasive plant program, which right now is pretty much her. She's really doing a lot of education, doing a lot of oversight on the ground management, especially in some of our state parcels. So that's kind of the nuts to bolts of where my program and expertise lie. And I'm sure there's way more detail if you want to know anything more about any of those. But I'd just be interested to know, if you have any questions related to those topics, I would be glad to answer them or go on and on about any of them. So I'll open it up a little right now if that works, Lisa.
That sounds great. So if anyone has any questions about forest health, go ahead and type it in the chat box. And while they're thinking of their questions, I'm going to ask you, Kathy, I've kind of asked this of all the foresters. Do you have a favorite tree? And if so, what is it and why?
Yeah, it's funny. I used to not really think I had a favorite tree. I grew up in Massachusetts, kind of near Rhode Island, the Rhode Island edge of things, and red oak are everywhere. And when I moved up here in '98 to the Northeast Kingdom, there's not a red oak to be found. You have to look really hard, and maybe it's a landscape tree, but they're not here. So I really, really just love red oak. I love the form, the how big they are, and it just actually reminds me of growing up back home where they're all red oak.
Yeah, I hear that's one of the climate ones to encourage potentially in your forest if you're looking at managing for climate change.
Definitely. I look at oak as sort of definitely something that we're going to see more of or encourage more of in this area, I would say, for sure. All right. So you manage the chat or do you need to?
I manage the chat. Yep, you don't even have to look at it. Close the chat box. It's not even for you to look at.
Won't even look.
Kathleen wants to know, she goes, fire is generally considered a Western hazard. I've heard us called the asbestos forest. How big a threat is it in Vermont and what are the general causes?
That's a great question, Kathleen, and you're right. It's really, it's a very different story out west than it is here. Western, they have not only the trees that can burn readily, they have usually evergreen forest with a closed canopy, making travel of flame very easy, and the conditions are very dry. So here, we're more, like you said, asbestos. We don't really have the cover that would be able to support that kind of fire that they have out west. Not to say it couldn't happen in localized areas, but I think more of our concern are the ground fires. So like in the spring, you would have a surface fire that would run maybe fast and hot because there's a lot of dry grass and dry leaves. But when you start getting into these prolonged drought periods, what's happening is your duff layer is starting to dry out, which then can support fires actually underground. And those are really hard to manage and hard to put out. And they take a long time and a lot of resources. And so really fire isn't, something to be panicky about here, but we do want to support our fire community and make sure that if there are threats for wildland fire, that people are aware of it. I hope that answered your question.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you a quick question on gypsy moths. So yesterday, a friend of mine from the Lincoln area posted this picture and she's like, what are these? And there were like 10 on the tree, and then they had the little egg mass, and there were like 50 to 100 littered on the ground beneath it. And I'm like, oh, those are gypsy moths. And then I went for a walk in the afternoon here in my town, and I walked back down a basswood tree. There's like 6 of them with their egg masses. Are we in for a gypsy moth explosion?
It's funny you say that, Lisa, because that's exactly what Josh Hallman, who's over in the Chittenden County area and has gotten some calls about gypsy moth. So we won't be looking at our traps until the end of the year because we're actually looking for egg masses. But I have a feeling, yeah, we're going to see a spike in it. You know, the Champlain Valley seems to be obviously where the oaks are. And yeah, I think we're going to probably see a higher level next year because we're getting calls everywhere.
So it's oaks that are most susceptible to gypsy moths?
Yeah, gypsy moth really like oak trees. They will eat, when populations are high, they will eat other things, but they really prefer oak. So, you know, over here in the kingdom, we're not going to see that much gypsy moth because there's just not the host species to sustain that population. Whereas over in the Champlain Valley, southern Vermont, you're more likely to have those. And that's actually where our monitoring plots fall as well. They're in southern Vermont and then along the Champlain Valley. So
it's interesting because it doesn't look like they favor a particular tree to lay their eggs on, because she had a picture of a conifer tree and I saw them on a basswood. But they like to eat oak, so that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I met, even if they put their eggs on a basswood, there's probably some oak trees around.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there are.
I don't think they care where they lay it as long as they have a host to eat when they hatch.
Interesting. Is there anything I can, if it was in my yard or something, is there anything I should think about doing to reduce that impact?
Basically trees can handle defoliation. They can handle a single year really probably pretty well. It's when it starts getting into 2, 3, 4 years of defoliation that tree health starts getting impacted. So I would say, you know, there's some cosmetic-y things you can do to help it, but there's really not a lot, I would say at this point, to try to manage that population.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Trevor would like to know if you could give your view on invasives. Is there any help coming from the federal government? And I don't know if he's talking about plants, insects, or both.
And actually, that would be good to clarify because I think it's a different beast, whether we're talking about plants or insects. What is my view on invasives? Overall, it's sort of, you know, I'm going to concentrate on plants. So invasive plants to me, you know, I've worked in this area a lot and I see a lot of varying attitudes. You know, some people are very purists and, you know, it should be the way it was and we need to get rid of these things. And others realize that, you know, things are going to change and there's going to be a certain level of these invasive plants coming around. It does, however, in many places can impact regeneration of desirable forest species. So it is a forest health, in my opinion, problem, and mainly in the area of regeneration. So as far as globally, I just don't think there's any, the government does care. They have a list of plants that they're trying to reduce the movement of, but as you probably are aware, there's not a lot of really what you need to do is on the ground stuff. And that takes time, it takes effort, and it's going to take money. So that's really, I think, where some of the lack of being able to do something comes from, is how do we get the money to come in and do this management? And so a lot of times we'll recommend you do stand level management. Before you want to go in and say, do a harvest, you would want to make sure your invasives are managed and taken care of, or in tandem with your harvest, have some kind of mechanism to make sure those invasives aren't coming in. As far as insects or diseases for that matter, that's where I think there's a little more for some particular pests. Thinking of emerald ash borer, say, where there was a federal quarantine and the federal government was very involved at first. They're about to remove that quarantine, basically because emerald ash borer is pretty much all over the United States, and that federal quarantine really didn't help, didn't stop the spread. So again, I think invasives are here to stay. It's unfortunate that that they do get here and that they do move around, but I just think we have to manage it on the level that we can and work together across the landscape to try to work together, whether it be invasive plants or insects.
Great, thanks. Alicia says she's noticed a lot of pine needles on the ground in various areas. Is this a particularly bad year for needle cast? And could you tell everyone else what needle cast might be?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alicia. That's a great question. So I don't, this particular situation has been recognized for a number of years. Excuse me, frog in the throat. Needle cast diseases are fungal diseases. Fungi really like moisture, so any rain event is going to encourage a fungus generally to grow and infect. So for the pine, the scenario is such that there's needles on the tree that have been infected. They might not have been brown at the beginning of the year. And as the new growth is coming out and those nice succulent needles are coming out, the fungus that's on the older needles then spreads to those new needles. And then as the green growth is coming out, all those other needles last year's or the year before's that were infected turn brown and drop to the ground. So that's what you've been noticing. It was probably, I would say about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago, it was this big flush of just brown needles coming out of the tree. So that's how the needle cast works. You're actually getting infected in the spring, but your symptoms aren't really going to show up to the following spring. And that's when it looks very devastating. I think when this first came on the scene, we were a little like, what is this? Where is it coming from? And it's a cycle that has continued. And honestly, we've seen trees have been impacted by this pretty dramatically in some areas. And we're trying to, we have plots out across the state looking at this as well, trying to figure out what the connection is with weather events, if this is a trend that's going to continue, or if it's just some trees are susceptible and others are not. Because I'll implore you to look at this next spring. Just really take a look at the landscape, and you'll notice some trees, the pine trees, are very green, and right next to it can be one that's really highly affected. So it's something we're looking at. It's been recognized to have happened in the past, looking at historical data. This isn't the first time that pines have had some kind of issue, but I think it's one of those, we're following it. There's more to learn, but it's caused by a fungus, and there's really not much we can do to manage the fungus. Managing the trees is how you would go about it. And again, anything that discourages fungal growth, meaning encourages foliar drying, would help reduce the disease occurrence. So if you had like a shade tree you were concerned about, you might want to give it more space, or you might want to thin the crown out a little bit. But on a forest level, that type of management is unlikely to happen.
Interesting. Rich wants to know about maple leaf cutters. He says, we in Williamstown are experiencing our 3rd year of heavy maple leaf cutter infestation. What are your thoughts on this insect?
Great question. So as I was mentioning earlier, we do those North American Maple Project plots. And I went out this week to a couple down in the Groton area, and the amount of maple leaf cutter already in some of those stands that made the foliage look like lace. They're so riddled with holes. We consider maple leaf cutter to be a late season defoliator, even though you might not think of this as late season. For defoliating insects, the most damage that can occur health-wise to a tree is a defoliator that happens in the spring. So something like forest tent caterpillar, where as soon as that foliage comes out, they're being devoured. It doesn't give the tree time to get more nutrients and more reserves. So as long as the leaves come out, they're able to photosynthesize, get those stores going, and then it gets defoliated. It's less of a concern. So we haven't in the past really been concerned about maple leaf cutter and tree health. That's not to say that individual trees might not succumb to it, because again, it's a stressor, and trees being in the same location all the time have a myriad stressors that we might not even really know about. So generally maple leaf cutter, not a health problem, but it wouldn't surprise me if one or two trees kind of went on a decline as a result of numerous defoliations.
Interesting. I'm going to ask you a little bit about beech. So, the beech bark disease, the nectria, can you explain a little bit about that process? But the other thing I want to share is that I was so excited. So, of course, COVID, I've done more hiking or walking in areas that I may not have been to before. And I found a beautiful beech, smooth bark that I couldn't even get my arms around. I was like literally hugging this tree. I was so excited to see this tree.
Yeah.
What's the story with this, and what was special about this tree I was hugging, and might we see more of them like that?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So beech bark disease has been around for a really long time. It's a combination of an insect and a fungus working in unison to cause the damage. The insect are beech scales, and if you've ever looked at the beech bark, they look like little tiny white flecks. So they're insects, they're piercing, sucking insects. They literally go right through the bark, but they're white and fluffy. And then, and very small. But if you have enough of them, you'll be able to see it. It can sometimes almost look white instead of gray. And that injury allows the fungus nectria to get in and then cause various size lesions. So then what happens is resistance, immunity, and all those things kick in, right? So a tree that's riddled with cankers and isn't smooth anymore has obviously been pretty highly susceptible to the damage. And that's when we start seeing crown decline. You think enough cankers around the bole will eventually affect the ability for the tree to transport nutrients up and down through the xylem and phloem. So you start seeing this sort of crown decline. What you noticed, however, is what I would call a resistant tree. So there is resistance out there, and that's really the big thing with this particular disease, is trying to promote those healthy beech and trying to eliminate those unhealthy beech. But one of the factors is beech will sprout from the roots. So if you take a sickly, unhealthy beech and cut it down, chances are pretty high that those roots are going to then send up clones. And then you've got not one tree that might be heavily impacted by beech bark disease, but now numerous trees. But the same concept is for a healthy tree as well. If you cut down a healthy tree, that'll also create more clones of the same tree. What we try to do is manage it in that way. We've had some really high amounts of beech regeneration in some of our state lands forests. Groton is a good example of that. So we want to promote the healthy beech, but we really want to get rid of that unhealthy beech. So really looking for those smooth bark trees, opening them up to keep them healthy and encouraging to grow. So there are things you can do when you find a healthy one to make that, continue that to grow. But it is hard to get rid of unhealthy beech without really making some pretty large openings. They respond well in the shade. So if you're keeping a closed canopy and cutting beech, you're going to get more of it. So there's a lot of factors to consider with the disease, the tree's immunity, and then the reaction of the tree itself to any type of management.
Well, I know on a lot of our calls, emerald ash borer has come up. And I know we've talked about resistant ash, and we've heard other foresters talk about keeping ash on the landscape and not just harvesting it all. Can you give your perspective as a forest health specialist on emerald ash borer?
Sure. I look at it in different ways. I agree. There needs to be, if we're going to find any resistance, it's going to be in the trees that are out there. And leaving as many as you can within reason, of course, depending on what the landowner's objectives are and what they've been growing their trees for, should be considered. The one thing that I think about is safety. So, ash is going to succumb to EAB more likely than not. and keeping in mind that there's a place for safety, and then there's a place for, making sure we can maintain it on the landscape. Around houses, around buildings, where people congregate, don't pick those ash to be the ones to try to save, right? You'd want to remove your ash where potentially them dying and falling would hurt people or property. But beyond that, then it's sort of, okay, what do we want to do for maintaining ash? And there's a lot of recommendations coming out, and I think you're going to see our department doing some experimental type management on the land just to see what options are. But I think paying attention to male and female, if you want to sustain ash on the landscape, there's male and female trees. So don't just think by leaving an ash, you've sustained potentially. Encouraging regeneration, but again, realizing that those efforts may or may not reap any rewards. You may have resistant trees, you may not. Really, the amount of trees that are resistant is pretty low, as we've seen around. But the other thing to consider too is the longer we have healthy trees and live trees, maybe the more likely we'll be able to keep those, because there's a lot of research going on. There's biocontrols are being released pretty widely. And so there's some hope that eventually we'll have some either resistance or something else that we can help manage this pest with. Hopefully, does that answer the question?
It does, it does.
I get in my own little head sometimes and I forget, like, did I actually answer the questions?
It's all good, it's all good.
Good.
It's a great question from Alicia. What pests and diseases should we be watching out for? Ones that aren't found in Vermont, or ones that we as landowners may not be as knowing about?
It's funny, what popped into my head was invasive plants more than anything, but there's a lot of things sort of, up and coming. There's oak wilt is something we're actually in the past year started looking at and looking for more widely. That is again, it's a fungal pathogen that gets moved by insects. It's usually a pretty, New York has a pretty good program in trying to manage it, but basically it's a fungus. It acts a lot almost like Dutch elm disease, where it's clogging up the xylem. It can go from tree to tree via roots and also via insect. So that's something to look out for. And oak wilt presents itself as sort of the browning foliage, the edges of the foliage are brown. So basically something that looks like it's under drought stress would be something to look for. There's an interesting beech leaf disease that we're still learning a lot about, that's coming out of New York. So that would be something else to look at as far as tree health, insect and disease wise. And then just a number of invasive plants that continually put pressure on coming into Vermont. And I'm not going to come up with any direct names. Black swallowwort is one that's around, but not really many places that we'd want to keep an eye on. Japanese stilt grass, things like that.
Great. Maggie wants to know, are there any pests or diseases to watch for with hedges of northern white cedar?
Yeah. Anything that's again, when you say hedge, I imagined like a trimmed hedge, but if you're talking just like a natural hedge, that's different. So, I mean, there's a lot of different fungal tip blights. If you're pruning and creating a hedge by trimming, that's kind of a stressful thing. So again, it really depends on the situation you're in. If you have anything particular, like a symptom that you want to know about, that would be helpful. But all trees have insect and disease pressure. It really is about the site that they're in, the condition they're in, and and whether it's an opportunity for those insects and disease to attack that tree.
So as a landowner, and I have questions, or I want someone to talk to someone about my trees or look at my trees, what are my avenues for getting answers?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people would generally reach out to the county foresters because that's something they're familiar with. But we have protection staff in each of the districts that work closely with the county foresters. So on what avenue you take, it may lead to the protection staff either way. But we have, our staff, we have 5 specialists that are located in each of the districts, and then a few other folks around as well. So you could reach out to us directly. We try to do triage as much as we can over the phone or using some photographs, but if necessary, we will go out for both like a landowner single tree and also for a forest health problem. So I think those are 2 avenues you can use. And if you want, I can send you all the contact information for that staff or point you to where they can be found on our website.
Awesome. Can you give an update on hemlock woolly adelgid in Vermont?
Sure. So hemlock woolly adelgid's pretty much down in the southeast, a little bit in the west as well. And it really hasn't been moving a whole lot. We monitor the insect population just like we do those others. And actually, usually we monitor the winter mortality because that gives us an idea of what this next year is going to look like. And this past year, winter mortality was not as high as we had hoped. So we do expect to see a fair amount of hemlock woolly adelgid. What we did this year, and we're going to make some adjustments, is we've looked at areas outside of the infested area, but not by town. We did it by county. So we're kind of looking in counties for hemlock woolly adelgid. We haven't found any. So now we're going to kind of bring it back a little bit closer down to where we know the population is and kind of spread out a little less far next year. So it's not really moving fast, but it is still here and it's probably going to be here to stay. And really, we're kind of hoping that the colder temperatures that we have will help knock those populations down every winter. So I hope never to see it up in the Northeast Kingdom.
So, with the threat of climate change, that could influence its spread, is what I'm hearing, if our colder temperatures, because even if we end up not having the snow melt or the snowpack, it might still be cold and icy, but they have that down south where they have more hemlock woolly adelgid. So I'm hearing right now we're good, but we don't really know.
Correct. And the other factor too is there's been a number of biocontrol releases. So again, that sort of, it's a weird concept when you release a biocontrol. You have to have a viable population of the pest in order to feed the biocontrol. So you almost have to wait for a certain level of infestation before you can bring in that management option. And then we monitor the biocontrol to make sure it's still there and it's still doing its thing. And biocontrols aren't going to be like eliminate the pest, but what the hope of biocontrol is that it keeps the pest at a level that won't kill the trees and will keep them viable. So there's also, discussions about things like refugia. Do we try to put these species in a place where they're going to survive longer so we can at least have the species on the landscape? So we haven't been really involved in that. Our job at this point is really to keep an eye on what the population is doing, where the spread is, and anticipating and doing the biocontrols.
Cool. So the other day I was sitting out on my porch and I had this really cool bug, and had long antenna, little clubs, and a little dot on the back. And I'm like, oh, I know what this is. This is the white Sawyer, often confused, if you don't really know, with the Asian longhorn beetle.
Yeah.
What's the status of Asian longhorn beetle in Vermont? And, because we've handed out information on it to our landowners, but I didn't think it was here yet. Are we still in that category?
We are still in that category. It is not here yet. And you're right. And the white spotted Sawyer, what's great about the white spotted Sawyer is when it starts coming out, like you were saying, people notice it and then they'll start calling. I've seen that beetle, or I have that beetle. And I look at that as like great success because people are aware of Asian longhorn beetle. They have a pretty good idea of what it looks like. And then they know they can contact us when they have it. So no, ALB is not here as far as we know. And you'd probably hear about it pretty quickly if it was. The newest infestation I've heard about, I think, is in North Carolina. And it's a pretty alarming situation there, kind of like the Worcester invasion. But I'm hopeful. Again, these things can get spread so easily through firewood. You know, we're always on the lookout and always looking at samples that people send us. But all the time it's this white spotted Sawyer.
Maggie has a great question. She wants to know, what's the best way for the public to help with forest health?
That's a great question. We actually have this network working with UVM extension of first detectors. And so we've got volunteers, volunteer stream that we use. We've used them in the past to do actual monitoring, going out and doing hemlock woolly adelgid egg mass surveys, going out and you know, triaging some of the EAB things. So there's I would say become familiar with what these pests are, become familiar with what a normal healthy tree looks like and what an unhealthy tree looks like. And if people have concern or questions that they can reach out, there's numerous resources for identifying pests. There's, is it iNaturalist? I don't use it a lot, but I know we get a lot of things through that. We also have if you go to vtinvasives.org, we have a report it function there. So if you saw anything that you thought was an invasive species, there's an avenue right there where you can report on it. And we review all of those things that come in. And if it warrants a visit, we'll go out and do a visit. So I think, you know, being aware of what the resources are, and also just being aware of what a healthy, good looking tree looks like.
Excellent. I would say too, from some of the programs that we've done with Elizabeth is, you know, if you have the opportunity and chance to treat some of your invasives, whether it be mechanically or with an herbicide, or to make sure you have a good, strong forest management plan with that 10-year view, and take that bird's eye view of your forests so that you can look at how you fit in the landscape, what kind of things you can do to promote those healthy overall forest stewardship goals. Let's see. That's it in the chat box right now. Come on, people, put some questions in there. So I still have a question on EAB. I'm going to jump back to EAB a little bit. You know, we talked about biological controls. I remember there was some reading that I did that there were some bupestrid beetles that might offer some control on EAB. Is that still something that is being considered? And I'm going to say not just in Vermont, but kind of nationwide. And what does that really look like?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of that question because I had a little technical difficulty. So you're talking biocontrols of EAB specifically?
Yeah, I just had read about the bupestrid, and so I didn't know if that was something that we were looking at. Not we, Vermont, possibly, but you know, the overall, because I know there's a state network talking about EAB and.
Yep. I'm sorry, Lisa, I don't know a lot of detail about the bupestrid itself, but we did do some biocontrol releases this year in 2 locations for EAB. One was on a state land parcel called L.R. Jones, and the other was up in South Hero, but it was not on state land. And those were not the bupestrid that I'm aware of. So it's we are actually initiating biocontrols for EAB. The way that works is you put out the pest, or you put out the biocontrol 3 times in the spring and then 3 times in the fall. So we're hoping we can get established a population at least in those areas. So we or Josh Hallman is the person in our team who's really in charge of the biocontrol and that of EAB. So I'm sorry, I don't have any further info about the rest.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Betsy wants to go back to beech bark disease. Did you say it's better to have an open canopy when getting rid of diseased or closed? Or closed, I don't know what closed, but to get rid of, or a closed canopy. That's what I mean. Okay.
All right. Yeah, let me try to explain that a little bit better. If you're trying to reduce the beech regeneration, you need openings, and some people might call them clear cuts. You can call them large patches, but the more open the ground, the less likely the beech will be able to regenerate. Beech regenerates very well in a closed canopy, but it does not regenerate very well in an open canopy. So for managing diseased beech and not wanting to regenerate diseased beech, I would say a larger opening would help with that. And as far as maintaining a healthy beech, I'm not suggesting you open it up like to the same extent, but making sure that the competition for that beech is reduced. So we try to just we can ease back the trees from the location of the beech, but not a clear cut or large patch, really just a few trees so that that beech tree is getting enough sunlight and not competing for nutrients as much. Hopefully that answers that question better.
Great, thanks. Maggie wanted to know what led you into this career?
It's so funny. I was wondering if anybody was going to ask you that. What led me to this career? What really led me to this was I didn't really want to be around people too much. I loved trees and I love the woods. And I was like, yeah, this will be great. I get to, look at all this cool stuff and really not have to deal with people. I actually got a forestry degree. And then when I worked for a consulting forester for a while, I realized I keep looking at the health. Like what's wrong with that? And just, it really drew me to that component of it. So then I ended up going back to school and getting a master's degree in plant pathology. So my real expertise and passion is in diseases. But anyway, so then I got that education and thought, yep, I'm going to be in the woods looking at this stuff. It's going to be great. But then when I landed here in Vermont, the fun part and the enjoyable part is actually sharing the information with the people. Going to a landowner, a homeowner, and he's asking about your tree and being able to give him the answers. So I actually like the people component, even though not being around people wasn't really got me here to begin with. So I hope that answers the question. I just I gravitate to unhealthy trees. So when I'm looking, drive around in a car with me for like a day. You'll never see the forest the same way again, because you'll be drawn to all those brown and discolored and weird looking trees.
I'll take you up on that when we're allowed to be together again.
Yeah, I've ruined it for a few people, but
I think it's fascinating to look at. It's like even like when you look at the decaying forest, the mushrooms, and and that aspect of the forest and the mycology. There's all aspects that are just. It's all so cool.
Yeah, it is. And I actually, when I started doing some plant pathology, the microscopic stuff. I mean, the things you can't even see. You think mushrooms are fascinating. The microscopic fruiting bodies of fungi are just incredible, and they're really cool to look at. So yeah, that's another part of it too, is just really neat stuff that you can find when you start looking under a microscope at this stuff.
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
You said, a lot of these diseases involve a fungus, right? But there's also the importance of fungus that's
yeah,
symbiotic with the tree.
Yeah. So some fungi, as you know, are just, they rot things away, right? They help the regeneration of the soil and the nutrients. But some of them, the mycorrhizal fungi, where they actually have a benefit associated with a tree, where they're actually helping get more of those nutrients and almost spread out the surface area. So yeah, the land of fungi is very fascinating. yeah, it's very cool. And just so you know, although I love looking at mushrooms, I do not ID mushrooms, and I do not tell people what to eat.
All
And
right,
it's funny because a lot of people say, oh, some of them are so easy. I go, I am not telling anybody to eat anything.
there are other experts that will do that.
Exactly.
Ken notes he's seen tip leaves on oak seedlings turned white and sometimes having a chewed look to them. Do you know what might cause this? Is that enough of a description?
Yeah, that's chewing insects really, unless you kind of see what it looks like, it's not that easy to diagnose unless you kind of find the insect. So I'm assuming when you say the tip leaves of an oak seedling, are you meaning like the first flush of the leaf? And if so, yeah, I don't know if there's anything in particular that attacks oak seedlings. But anything that's kind of turning, here's a question. If you say it's turning white, look at the leaf, and if it looks like there's a bunch of tiny dots that actually make up that white appearance, that might be a piercing sucking insect. I'm sure you've all seen that, where part of the leaf surface just looks a little off or discolored. If you look closely and it looks like individual cells have been damaged, that's probably a piercing sucking insect. There haven't been any big insects or diseases that I'm aware of on oak that we are concerned about. Obviously the gypsy moth, but there are a number of pests that do attack oak. So the list is pretty wide.
All right. Kathleen had a question. She says she has a large infestation of burning bush that came from a neighboring landowner who planted it. Are nurseries finally on board with stopping the sale of burning bush and other invasives?
Good question, Kathleen. So in the state of Vermont, there is a noxious weed quarantine. It's actually managed by the Agency of Agriculture. And if there's also a Vermont Invasive Exotic Plant Committee that's been in existence for quite some time. It's an ad hoc group. It's not official in any way, but that team helped inform and kind of create that first invasive plant or noxious weed quarantine. Then, and a lot of them were things that really weren't sold in nurseries. But then and the dates might be a little off, but I believe is in 2013 or 2014, burning bush, Norway maple, and barberry were added to the quarantine. And I think there was a 2 or 3 year phase out period for nurseries. And then they are not supposed to be selling them anymore. So I believe since 2017, those three trees, and maybe it was before that, again, I'm getting old and dates escape me, but those should no longer be sold in Vermont.
Okay, great, thanks. Betsy was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the communication between roots and trees and what goes on. I think, you know, people have heard about the wood wide web and how, what are we learning? What are we thinking?
Communication between the roots and the trees. I'm actually not, I guess I haven't really been up on what's coming around about that, but you know, in general, there's a lot of life going on in the root system. Like you were saying, you know, we've got fungi that are down there doing these things. And as far as like things can travel from one tree to another in the root system, it's most likely going to happen the same species, but I think other times it's not necessarily unheard of. But I don't think I can go much deeper into that concept without, knowing more.
All right. Rich notes, yellow birch seem to be relatively trouble-free at this point. Are there things on the horizon that might be an issue for them?
Oh, gosh, I hope not, because I agree. Yellow, you know, you go out and you see the maples getting hammered and the oaks are getting hammered and the pines, and you look at the yellow birch, you go, yeah, that looks pretty good. They do get a bunch of pests, but they're generally not of a health concern. They get a number of foliage pests. They get some leaf diseases, but as far as there's no vascular disease that I'm aware of and stuff like that. So I don't think we should be concerned at this point.
All righty. So that's it in the question box right now. What else might you want landowners to know or think about or be on the lookout for?
It's funny, when I just mentioned the word Norway maple, I was like, I really should talk a little bit about this tree. Maybe that's one area that I think, landowners, homeowners, Norway maple, in my opinion, is just a bad tree. We don't want it in our forest. We don't want it anywhere near it. I understand how wonderful it is as a street tree because it can handle all kinds of stress. And I think something like Norway maple can escape people because if you're not real familiar with the distinguishing features, you might just think it's a sugar maple. So I would say being aware of what you have in your yard, in your landscape that can potentially impact the forest is something that I think is good. If people recognize something, sometimes people have different levels of ability to see detail. Some people say, oh, my tree just died. And when you realize, no, it's been dying for 5, 6, 7 years. So I would say just try to be observant, like what's happening in your forest. Is there a plant there that looks unfamiliar to you that you think, what's going on? Or just looking again at being familiar with what a healthy tree looks like and what damage looks like. So
I have to tell you, it's so funny because you talk about Norway maple. We had a cooperator who had a Norway maple up on his property in Derby. And we used to walk his property for the training. And he's like, I kind of leave it here for an example, but now but it wasn't producing seed yet. And so then he cut it down because like, I needed to get rid of it. But it was just this one Norway maple in the woods. It was the weirdest thing. So, and it was interesting to share that with many people that Norway maple is something that is a threat to our forests. And that's one of the things that I've learned. From Porch Forum, for all these, I'm from Porch Forum, and some of my cooperators have heard this story, but someone posted, I have burning bush to give away. Who wants burning bush? So that's what I did. I'm like, oh my God. I said, so I wrote back and I said, burning bush is an invasive species. Please don't share it. It's, and I put a link to VT invasives and so this person just wrote back on, from Porch Forum. So everybody's seeing this in the community. And she writes back and goes, I've never seen it get out of my garden. And it's not, and then she says, and VT invasive says our beloved sugar maple is an invasive. So I'm like, okay, forget it. I'm not even going to bother because,
right.
It's, I don't comment on things on Facebook. I don't, generally because it just, So my husband says to me, you have to comment back. So I write this very special email that says, you're right. Burning bush is beautiful because they said burning bush was so beautiful. I said, you're right. Burning bush is beautiful. However, and I went on and explained it. I gave some examples and I went back to VT invasives and I said, and VT invasives notes that Norway maple is an invasive, not our beloved sugar maple. And here's the link, And the person responded back, I'll admit when I am, thanks for the information. I'll admit when I am wrong. Any other conversation we can have offline.
Now that you've told me how wrong I was. Well, the thing about Norway maple too is I've seen people with the Crimson King version, right? The red leaf maple.
Yes.
And what happens is their offspring many times revert back to the green one. So even though I've looked for it and it's not reproducing, you got to look for the green version of it too. And typically I think once you're trained in seeing it, it's very easy to pick out, the leaves are darker green. They've got 7 points instead of 5. And you pick one of those leaves off and that milky substance coming out of the end is like Norway. And then here's a nice thing about Norway maple. They get a disease called giant tar spot. Sugar maple does not get that disease. So it's another kind of you can use the fungus to do the identification of the tree species, which is kind of cool. So My
very
least favorite
cool.
tree is Norway maple.
Okay, so we have your most favorite red oak and your least favorite Norway maple. All right, I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're rounding on the 10 o'clock hour. I do like to keep these to our 10 so everybody can get out and enjoy their Fridays and the weekend. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us your knowledge on forest pests and invasive plants and all those things that are important for us to know about in order to maintain forest health. I'm going to let Kathleen, pipe in and offer her thank yous as well. We do hope all of you will join us again next week for our coffee series. We'll send emails out next week letting you know who's going to be on board and what they're going to be talking about. You can check our calendars online as well and sign up for our e-newses. Kathleen, do you have anything else to say?
I just want to thank Kathy for joining us this morning and everyone else who hopped on to hear from her. These Friday morning chats are great. Although I have to say from the West Coast, it's very early in the morning.
Oh,
That's where I am this
oh
morning.
my.
So you got me
But you
out of
can
bed
still
early,
join us.
Kathy. Thank you.
I hope it was worth it, Kathleen.
Absolutely, every bit.
Okay,
Much
great.
appreciated.
No problem. Glad to do it.
All righty, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.